All right, so we've been looking at the foreign policy of Harry Truman and how that's been developing throughout the Cold War. But let's turn our attention to his domestic policy as well. In the 1940s, we're going to see Truman having to deal with the changes that are taking place in the United States following the end of the war, things like demobilization, challenges from his Republican opponents in 1946, and other things like that. So let's turn our attention now to domestic politics. All right, so the domestic situation and for Truman in the 1940s is going to be dominated by demobilization. The rapid demobilization, that is the return of American soldiers to civilian life following the war, is going to be a major issue for Truman, something that he's going to have to manage. As far as personally speaking, some of these men are going to find it difficult to readjust to civilian life. And we'll see that in things like the rise in the divorce rate to nearly double what it was before the war. Many are going to take advantage of the GI Bill, going to college and things like that. However, most of them will enter the labor force. This is going to result in nearly more than 2 million women workers being forced out of their jobs as well. We're also going to see the abolition of wartime agencies that place strict regulations on production, labor, prices, all of this leading to a sharp rise in prices and inflation being the biggest economic problem that Truman will have to deal with in the immediate aftermath of the war. Now, Truman is going to try and revive some of the sort of New Deal spirit of his predecessor, FDR, by pushing what he calls a fair deal for Americans. This is, again, like I say, trying to revive that New Deal momentum. He's got an election coming up in 1946, a midterm election coming up in 1946. And so he's hoping to maintain some control, particularly congressional control, for his party. What the fair deal will largely include is an improvement to the social safety net, as well as living standards for Americans. The program will call on Congress to raise minimum wage, enact national health insurance, expand public housing, Social Security and aid to education, all these kind of things. And we can see some real movement for this as well. There are a number of strikes that take place immediately following the war. Soaring inflation will result in a drop in real wages earned by workers, and it's going to affect a wide range of industries. Steel, auto, coal, many of our key industries will be affected by these strikes. We're also going to get a massive movement to unionize new industrial plants in the South. A lot of these sort of manufacturing plants start to spring up in the South, particularly during the war. And so Operation Dixie, as it was called, was the campaign to unionize the South and to try and break the political hold of anti-labor conservatives. They sought support in industries like textile and steel, as well as agriculture, commercial agriculture. Truman is extremely concerned over the economic effect of these strikes. He threatens to draft striking railroad workers, and ultimately a court order is used against striking miners. So Truman actually coming down pretty hard against the strikers, which is something of a departure of the policies of his predecessor, which was fairly pro-union. Out of all this turmoil, Truman is actually going to lose some support. The 1946 midterm election will show some Republican gains in Congress. Middle-class voters will be really alarmed by these striking actions. Labor will be disappointed with Truman, particularly because of actions like court orders and draft threats. And Operation Dixie will not succeed. Employers will vigorously oppose these efforts and ultimately be successful. Politicians will also be fairly reluctant and will also get a touch of racism for good measure. White workers being somewhat reluctant to join interracial unions in the South as well. Ultimately, the consequences of this Republican-dominated Congress is that the fair deal will fail. Instead, we'll get tax cuts for the wealthy, the Taft-Hartley Act, which will seek to reverse some of the major gains made by organized labor in the past decade, and will include provisions like authorization for the president to suspend strikes through a cooling off period, banning sympathy strikes or secondary boycotts. These are essentially actions not taken directly at an employer, but at those who did business with them. It will outlaw closed shops, authorize states to pass right-to-work laws, force union officials to swear loyalty oaths, and have a massive impact on organized labor. As the population and capital investment shifts to states with right-to-work laws, the act will contribute to a huge decline in organized labor as a share of the nation's workforce overall. So Truman not getting anything that he wanted in 1946. Truman is also going to make a splash early on with civil rights. The civil rights movement is something that we normally characterize with the 1960s, but it's really going to get its start in this post-war period, immediately following the war, and we'll talk about it even more in the next chapter when we talk about the 1950s a little bit more as well. But we're going to get some early movement in that direction with support from President Truman. We'll get a number of anti-discrimination measures coming into play on both the state and local levels. 11 states will enact fair employment practice commissions, and pass laws against discrimination and access to jobs and public accommodations. By 1952, nearly 20% of Black Southerners were registered to vote, which is roughly a 7-fold increase from 1940. The vitality of the Civil Rights Coalition is also going to be coming into play, and it's starting to take shape into what we would recognize it as later. We'll get a broad coalition among labor supporters, religious groups, as well as other Black organizations, community organizations that will support these measures. We're also going to get a growing response to the practice of lynching. In 1952, for the first time in 70 years, we'll actually have a year with no lynchings. We'll also get some more widely publicized events in Major League Baseball. The integration of Major League Baseball by this gentleman down here in the bottom right, Jackie Robinson. This serves as a kind of indication that race relations in the United States are somewhat in flux. In 1947, the Brooklyn Dodgers will challenge the exclusion of Black players from Major League Baseball, with the addition of Jackie Robinson to the roster. His dignity in the face of constant verbal abuse gained him nationwide respect, and his ability to play baseball, to play the sport, earned him Rookie of the Year. His success also opens the door to the more general integration of the league. It's also important to note that Robinson was a veteran of the war, and it was largely his experiences during the war, and particularly in Europe, where pervasive anti-Black racism is not a thing, that ultimately encourages him to take the stand that he does in this event as well, with Major League Baseball. We'll also see a commission on civil rights in releasing a devastating indictment of racial inequality in the United States. It's essentially a report that comes from the commission, and in that report they call on the federal government to assume responsibility for abolishing segregation and ensuring equal treatment in areas like housing, employment, education, and criminal justice. Now, this isn't going to get broad support in the federal government, but we will see Truman take some initiatives as a result. A program will be presented to Congress that will include permanent civil rights commission, national laws against things like lynchings and poll taxes, and actions to ensure equal access to jobs and education. Unfortunately, this program was defeated in Congress, pretty much as expected. Truman is working with an opposition Congress at this point, and they didn't pass a single item in that program. Truman will have more control over some things, though, and he will actively support the desegregation of the armed forces by issuing executive order in July of 1948. The Army comes under the direct control of the president, so that's something that he can do. Part of the feeling for that are his own personal sentiments. For Truman, being somewhat anti these policies, although I would definitely use the qualifier somewhat when talking about this. Also, the Cold War implications. If America is going to be a champion of freedom, it doesn't make any sense for us to have these kinds of things happening at home. It's a similar issue as was raised by the whole Double V campaign during the war. The idea that the United States is fighting for freedom and yet not practicing it at home. It's also partly a political strategy. We are right before an election in 1948, and in order to win support of minority voters and liberal progressives, Truman really doubles down on these policies. So there is a mixture of things going on here. All right, so in our next lecture, we're going to have a look at how Truman's domestic policies affected his re-election campaign in 1948.